questions I get asked all the time about herbs all relate to how to make them the most productive, how to prevent flowering, and how to properly prune and harvest. And the great thing is, all this relates back to harvesting frequently and pruning properly. And when I say pruning properly, don't get worried, because herbs are so forgiving and they're so easy to grow. But just like everything, there's a right and a wrong way to do things, or at least best practices. And so in today's video, I'm going to be sharing all the best practices with your herbs so that you can get the best harvest possible all throughout the season. So the very first thing is that you never want to prune more than 1/3 of a plant at a time. So for example, if you wanted a big batch of pesto, you don't want to prune more than 1/3 of this entire plant. So if you have multiple plants growing, that's even better, because you can prune a little bit off of each plant. But if you need a lot of herbs all at once, keep that in mind for whatever recipe you're making, so you always leave at least 2/3 of the plant. You also want to make sure that you don't harvest and prune your herbs when they're stressed. So I typically will water my plants thoroughly and deeply the night before and then harvest the next morning, or I'll prune and harvest in the evening, as long as the plants appear to be healthy and they're not wilting over from the hot heat from the day. The next best practice is to harvest frequently, which promotes new growth and prevents your herbs from flowering. You can see right here I have oregano and thyme that is flowering, but the reason for that is I have not harvested any of this all season long. I planted these herbs in early March and I just haven't harvested anything just because time got away. I was busy planting my vegetable garden and doing other things, and so I just haven't got around to harvesting these herbs, and we don't tend to use much thyme and oregano early on in the season. But like I mentioned, herbs are very forgiving, so I'm just going to prune off all of these flowers, and the herbs are going to continue growing all throughout the season. So if your herbs do go to flower, you want to try to harvest those flower stalks off as soon as possible to encourage new growth. But don't worry, if they have gone to flower, you can just prune off those flowers and your herbs are going to keep growing. And then as you're pruning, you want to try and prune right above a leaf node. You can see right here on this basil plant, a leaf node would be right above where there's 2 new young leaves growing. And the reason why that is the best cut to make is because those new fresh leaves are already starting to branch out. And when you make that cut right above, that encourages that bottom growth to continue growing. If you prune below that, you're not going to damage your plant, but that is the best place where you can make a cut. So to take an even closer look, I just wanted to show you a close-up view of what that looks like, so you can see exactly where that leaf node is. Sometimes when you watch a video from afar, it's hard to tell where that point is, and so this is the leaf node right here. And then when it comes to sage and rosemary, they're a bit different. So with sage, the easiest thing is just to clip off the outer lower leaves, which are the older leaves. All the fresh growth is always going to be in the center of your plant. So harvest just a few leaves at a time. You typically don't use as much sage when you're cooking with it. However, if you want to dry big batches of sage, then go ahead and harvest off an entire stem, and you can do the same thing and just clip right above one of the leaf nodes. But typically just harvesting the lower outer leaves is a really easy way to harvest your sage. And then with your rosemary, rosemary tends to grow more upward, and so if you want to keep it more compact and growing outwards, then you can just find your main leader and just clip that back at a point right above 2 outward facing stems. And now that's going to encourage this rosemary to branch outwards, and now you can just use this to cook with or dry it, whatever you want to do. And if you ever harvest your fresh herbs and you don't have a use for them right at the moment, chickens love herbs and they're really great for chickens. So if there's herbs that they don't like to eat, sometimes rosemary is an herb that the chickens won't necessarily eat, but I will just sprinkle the rosemary leaves throughout their nesting boxes and it helps deter pests. But then there's other herbs like basil and mint that chickens love. So anytime you harvest an herb that you don't have a use for in the moment, go ahead and feed it to your chickens if you have a backyard flock. And then as far as what to use to prune and harvest your herbs, I really like these garden snips. They are pointy, which allows you to make really precise cuts. They're really sharp and they're spring-loaded, so they're really easy to use. They don't get stuck like scissors do. And other garden shears just tend to be a little bit too big for most herbs. However, when you get really woody stems, like sometimes your lavender and rosemary will get, then sometimes some bigger garden shears are useful. But for the most part, I love these garden snips right here. So I'll be sure to link to those in the description for you. However, if you're out in the garden and you don't have a pair of garden shears or snips on you, you can also just come in and pinch off the tops of your herbs with your fingers, because a lot of times you'll notice that your basil will start developing seeds. And so as you walk through the garden, just go through and pinch them off with your fingers. And then when it comes to harvesting your thyme, this thyme right here has all just flowered. But the cool thing with thyme is that the flavor isn't really affected once the plant starts flowering. So I can just come through and clip off all of these flowering stems, and that's going to keep my plant producing all throughout the rest of the season. So you just prune off all of these flowers and your thyme will keep on producing. And there's not really, thyme is just so productive, it kind of spreads like a weed even. And so, and the leaves themselves are really tiny. So unlike basil and larger leaved herbs, you can just come through and clip your thyme really however you want, because then when you get into the kitchen, you're just going to use your fingers and pull off all those leaves. Whereas usually basil and larger herbs you would maybe chop up with a knife. Thyme has a lot of stem, and so you want to just pull off the leaves like that with your fingers to use up the thyme. And so harvesting doesn't need to be quite as precise with your thyme. And then with your oregano is easier to harvest because it has bigger leaves. And what you can do is you just come in and you just prune right above a leaf node. And now you can just go in the kitchen and pull off all these leaves. They come off super easy. You can just pull them right off the stem and use them up. So this oregano right here is starting to flower, and when oregano gets ready to flower, it starts getting tall, and you can see how tall these branches are. And then right here, they're already starting to flower. So I'm going to come back pretty low on this one, prune right above a leaf node, and clip off this entire stem down low because it was just getting tall and stretched out and then starting to flower. So I want to bring that back down low so that some new lower growth can develop on those stems. And then another really productive herb is mint. And this mint right here is kind of looking a little bit sad because it was getting too much sun, and mint really would benefit from some afternoon shade or even shade half of the day, especially as it starts getting warm. So when it was cooler, this mint was thriving and it was growing really, really good. But now that it's getting hot, I've moved it so it's receiving more shade, especially in the hot afternoon. And I may even move it somewhere that gets even more shade if it doesn't start perking back up. But same thing, just like with all of your herbs, you want to just harvest frequently to keep it productive all throughout the season. The next thing to keep in mind as you're pruning and harvesting your herbs is that herbs such as mint, oregano, thyme, and rosemary, and many others are perennials that are going to continue growing throughout the winter. And so it's a best practice to stop pruning at least 1 month before your first frost so that the tender young growth doesn't get killed off or damaged. And if you don't have an herb garden growing yet, it is such a great way to dip your toes into gardening. They're so easy to grow, they're very low maintenance, many herbs are even pretty drought tolerant. And if you want to have an entire garden bed just like this one I've been showing you here today, these are all planted in an Ollie Gardens raised bed. I love this raised bed, especially for my herbs, but it does great for vegetables and other things as well. I'll be sure to link to it in the description. But you can even grow herbs in small containers on your patio, directly in the ground. There are so many ways that you can plant herbs. There's even herbs that you can plant in your kitchen windowsill. So definitely consider herbs if you do not have an herb garden growing yet. And then lastly, I know I mentioned to harvest your herbs frequently to prevent them from going to seed, but there might actually be a time when you want to let them flower and go to seed so that you can collect the seeds to build up your own seed supply. And these right here are green onions, which I know are technically not an herb, but they're so easy to grow and they're even easier to save seeds from. And so if you head to this next video, I go over the exact step-by-step process of how to save these green onion seeds. So head to that video next and I'll see you there.